Peregrine caught the torn bride ticket before it slid between the porch boards, and beneath the address of his homestead, someone had written, "Atwater Receiving House," in red pencil. Beside the dust-caked wagon, Georgiana kept two little girls pressed against her skirts, while he stood on the upper step, gripping his hat in both hands, facing the wife he had prayed for but never seen. "Valeria will not be coming," she said. "The letters were mine, and 2 riders from Atwater's line followed us as far as your road." Wind moved across the Yellowstone Valley, sharp with dry sage and early frost. Nehemiah Gunderson, the hurried driver who had dropped their last canvas bag in the dirt, did not wait for Peregrine to answer. He snapped the reins and turned his team hard toward the main trail. On the far rise, 2 riders paused long enough to study the Sutton porch before disappearing behind the grassland. Peregrine looked at the woman. She was perhaps 32, her face marked by the kind of exhaustion that did not come from one journey. The older girl, near 10, watched him with fierce, gray eyes. The younger, perhaps 7, trembled against the faded blue cotton of Georgiana's dress. "Valeria Reeves is the name on the agreement," Peregrine said, his voice low, measured to keep the tension out of the yard. "And you are telling me you wrote the letters?" "I wrote them," Georgiana said. She did not beg. She stood at an angle, one hand resting on each child's shoulder. "My sister chose the meaning. I put it into words. I am Georgiana Vaughn. I apologize for bringing more than you bargained for. If you cannot take us in, I ask only for water before we walk back to the trail station." Peregrine looked down at the ticket in his hand. The red pencil mark felt like a threat pressed directly against his door. He had spent 9 years on this claim alone. He had built the house tight against the winter, dug the well deep, and finally admitted to himself that surviving was not the same as living. He had written through a matrimonial bureau asking for a woman who wanted a quiet life. He had not asked to be the unwitting endpoint of a redirected carriage, nor had he asked for children. He felt the sharp sting of a man discovering he might be a fool. Then his gaze dropped to the younger girl. She was trying to hide a split leather shoe beneath the hem of her dress, though 2 toes had already escaped. Peregrine did not reach for the colt inside the door. He did not demand the rest of the story. Georgiana had already measured the distance back to the road with her eyes. He could almost see the miles settling onto her shoulders. "The sun is dropping," Peregrine said. "You and the girls will stay tonight. We will sort out the paper tomorrow." Georgiana didn't flood him with gratitude. "Does the room have an interior latch?" "It does." "And the well?" "Around the back. The pump needs priming." She nodded once. She kept the canvas bags exactly where they were by the porch. "We will not be a burden, Mr. Sutton." "I didn't say you were," he replied, stepping back to leave the doorway clear. That evening, the house felt entirely different. For 9 years, the only sounds had been the shifting of the timber and the wind. Now there was the clink of spoons and the hushed, careful voices of children trying not to be noticed. Peregrine set 4 bowls of beef stew on the oak table. He took his seat and watched Georgiana quietly move half the meat from her own bowl into the girls' bowls. She did it without breaking conversation, with the practiced hand of someone accustomed to eating last and least. He did not call attention to it. He rose, brought the skillet from the cast-iron stove, and set the largest wedge of cornbread beside Georgiana's elbow. Then he turned away before she could refuse it. "Ida," Peregrine said, looking at the older girl, "do you know how to read the numbers on a cattle tag?" Ida looked at her aunt first, then at him. "I know my numbers up to 1,000, sir." "Good, because my math gets poor when the wind blows." Georgiana kept her eyes on her plate, but Peregrine saw the slight easing of her shoulders. Later, when he was checking the window latches, she accidentally repeated a line from the letters. Clara had asked if the house was too quiet, and Georgiana had, "A house shouldn't be so quiet you can hear a person regret." Peregrine stopped, with one hand on the latch. It was the exact sentence from the second letter, the one he had carried in his breast pocket for 2 months. He had agreed to the marriage because of it. The name on the envelope had been Valeria, but the mind he had waited for, the dry humor, the careful hope, the loneliness that never begged, had always belonged to Georgiana. The knowledge unsettled him more than the red mark on the ticket. The next morning, Peregrine found Georgiana's bags still packed and tied by the door. She had hauled water, stoked the fire, and seated the girls at the table with one slate between them. Clara formed her letters with her tongue caught between her teeth. Ida corrected her in a whisper that sounded remarkably like Georgiana. She approached him before he could leave for the pens. "Mr. Sutton, I propose a temporary arrangement. I can teach children from the neighboring countries. Ida has missed nearly a year, and Clara ought to be reading by spring. I can manage your ledger and keep the house. In exchange, we ask shelter until the next supply wagon comes through." "I don't need a hired hand who works for the board," Peregrine said flatly. "I prefer to earn our space." "You do not need to earn the floor beneath you. Run the school, handle the ledger. I will run the cattle. We share the housework because we live here, not because you owe me." She looked at him, searching for the catch. Finding none, she gave a stiff nod. 3 days later, the reality of the red pencil mark caught up with them. Peregrine drove the buckboard into the settlement to pick up flour salt and winter medicine for the calves. Georgiana and the girls rode with him. Inside the dry goods store, the smell of roasted coffee and oiled leather was cut by the clerk's sharp voice. He did business with Earl Atwater's freight company and looked pleased to be carrying its message. "Ticket's been marked, Sutton," the clerk said, tossing the supply list across the counter. "Atwater's representative came through yesterday. Says you ordered a childless bride. Says the woman you received is an imposter, and the children were never in the bargain." A man in a bowler hat stepped from the back room. Atwater's man. "The woman owes transit fees," he said smoothly, "and a penalty for substitution. If she cannot pay, she goes to the receiving house to work off the debt. The girls go to the county poorhouse." Cold anger moved through Peregrine. He wanted to put the bowler-hatted man through the coffee barrels. Instead, he planted both palms on the counter and left Georgiana room to answer for herself. He would not protect her by making her smaller. "Mrs. Vaughn and the girls are on my land by my invitation," Peregrine said, his voice dropping into the quiet register that once made saloon drunks reconsider their choices. "Your paper does not outrank their right to leave that store with me." "She's a fraud, Sutton," Atwater's man. "Where is the proof she was ever supposed to bring children?" Georgiana stepped up. She did not hide behind Peregrine. "The original letter mentioned the children explicitly. Whoever processed the transit cut those lines out." "And where is this original letter?" the man challenged. "It is no longer in my baggage," she said evenly. Atwater's man. "Then Atwater Freight stops every shipment to the Sutton claim. No salt, no medicine." "Let us see how your herd fares through January." Outside in the cold autumn sun, Georgiana stood by the wagon. She didn't apologize, but her face was pale. "I will leave. If I am gone, your supply line is restored." Peregrine unhitched the horses. "How many days do you need before you decide what you actually want to do?" 3 days, she said. "And a horse." "You can have the horse," Peregrine said. "The 3 days are your choice, not my limit." Through the next week, the house found a strange, shared rhythm. Georgiana turned the kitchen table into a schoolroom each morning. 3 children from neighboring claims rode over to join Ida and Clara. Peregrine began timing barn work so he could hear her lessons through the open window. Twice he caught himself carrying the same coil of rope past the house, for no reason better than hearing her laugh at a spelling mistake. He realized she had noticed that he read more slowly than she had assumed. After that, freight notices appeared on the table in large, clear, block letters. She never mentioned the change, and never corrected him before the children. Peregrine had been pitied before. This was not pity. It was courtesy so exact that it made him want to deserve it. They chafed against each other's habits. One morning, Peregrine found her hauling a heavy bucket of water from the pump before dawn. "Put it down," he said, stepping off the porch. "I am capable of carrying water, Mr. Sutton." "I didn't say you weren't. I said you don't need to prove your worth by exhausting yourself before the sun is up." She dropped the bucket. Water splashed over the dry dust. "Do you want a woman who just sits and watches you work?" "I want a woman who lives long enough to decide about tomorrow," he said. He didn't take the bucket from her. He stood there and asked, "Do you want me to carry the water, or do you want me to watch the girls while you do it?" She stared at him for a long moment. "Carry the water," she said. It was the first burden she had handed him, without an apology attached. Life on the claim found its small mercies. Clara named the oldest, meanest bull in the pen Bishop because, she explained, "He looks at everyone like they are about to be condemned." "A fitting title," Peregrine had replied. "He hasn't listened to a word I've said in 5 years." Ida tested Peregrine constantly. She asked about blizzards tracking cattle and his years as a deputy. He did not build himself into a hero. Sometimes he told her the badge only meant standing between angry men until they grew tired of hearing themselves. When a calf chewed the corner from Ida's arithmetic paper, Peregrine inspected the damage and declared, "That is the first student I have met who truly digested mathematics." Georgiana laughed, quick, startled, unguarded. Peregrine spent the rest of the day discovering that silence could feel wrong once he had heard that sound. But the outside world did not stay outside. Preparations for the Sunday harvest prayer brought neighbors to the Sutton yard. Wagons rolled in carrying benches and covered dishes. With them came the whispers. Peregrine was stacking firewood when he heard a man by the wagon speaking entirely too loud. "Used the brats as bait. Trapped a man alone on his claim. I hear there never even was a Valeria." Peregrine set down the wood and stepped between the speaker and the porch. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Any letters that came to this house were altered before they arrived," Peregrine said to the faces staring back at him. "Any man who has a question for Georgiana will ask it only when she is ready to answer. If you think I've been played for a fool, you can think it. But my stupidity doesn't give a single one of you the right to insult a guest on my land." He did not explain the letters or tell the truth that was not his. He drew the line and stopped, leaving the next step to her. Georgiana stepped out onto the porch. She looked at the crowd, her hands steady by her sides. "The girls are my nieces," she said. "Their names were removed from the transit papers without my consent. I will speak on the rest of it when the time is right." When the crowd dispersed to set up the tables, she found Peregrine by the barn. "Atwater will cut your winter contracts," she said. "How much will you lose?" "Enough to make it a lean spring," he answered. "I won't let you pay a price without knowing what you are buying," she said. "Come to the kitchen tonight, after the girls are asleep." The house was quiet, save for the wind rattling the window panes. A single kerosene lamp burned on the kitchen table. Georgiana set 3 things in the circle of light: a handwritten draft of a letter, a small tintype photograph of a woman who looked like a softer version of herself, and a torn piece of a map marking a grove of cottonwood trees. "Valeria was my sister," Georgiana began. "She is the woman in the photograph. She is the name on your contract." She sat with her hands folded tight. Valeria, she explained, had answered his advertisement. She could not write and feared sounding foolish, so Georgiana supplied the words. On the journey west, Valeria learned what Atwater's line was doing. Women were redirected, their fares altered, their debts made impossible. Instead of reaching homesteads, some were delivered to receiving houses and told they must work until accounts invented by Atwater were paid. "Valeria stole one of Atwater's ledger books," Georgiana said. "We ran from the station, but we were on foot for 3 days in the rain. She took a fever. She died just past the territorial line." Georgiana had buried her sister by a stand of cottonwoods. Fearing Atwater's men would search the body, she buried a tin box containing the ledger and the original letters a few paces from the grave. "I took the girls, Georgiana. I promised her I would be their mother. I kept coming to your claim because your letter was the only one that asked what kind of life a woman wanted to build, instead of how much work she could do." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I lied to you, Mr. Sutton, and I am sorry." Peregrine looked at the map, then at her. "You apologize for writing the letters, for burying your sister, for keeping 2 children alive, and for carrying evidence against a thief. You apologize as if surviving was an impoliteness." "You prayed for someone to walk into your house," Georgiana fired back her defense, flaring. "But you keep the house, as if they must leave before you get used to the sound of their footsteps." The words landed because they were true. Peregrine had left the door open, yet kept part of himself braced for the sound of wheels departing. Peregrine leaned forward, his forearms on the table. "I prayed for the woman who wrote those letters. I have been waiting for your voice. The name on the ticket was the only part I misunderstood." Georgiana, a shaky, fractured breath. "Atwater is coming here on Sunday. I need the tin box. I need the girls to stop running. I need you to know the whole truth before you decide what to do with us." "I didn't ask for a wife so I could have someone to dismiss," Peregrine said. Before dawn the next morning, hoofbeats struck the frozen yard. Earl Atwater rode in with 2 armed men and a district clerk he meant to use as a witness. He halted where Georgiana's wagon had first stood. Peregrine stepped onto the porch without his gun belt. He removed his hat and set it on the rail, leaving both hands empty and visible. Restraint cost him more than anger would have, which was precisely why he chose it. "You're harboring a fraud, Sutton," Atwater called out. "Valeria Reeves owes my company transit fees. Any person holding her property or papers surrenders them to me. Deliver the woman, or I cancel every cattle contract you have, and the clerk here notes your claim as hostile to commerce." Peregrine looked from Atwater to the armed men. "Georgiana Vaughn is not mine to hand over." "Then we will search her bags," Atwater said, dismounting. "You will not cross this threshold unless she invites you," Peregrine said. His voice fell into that dangerous quiet. He did not draw a weapon. He simply occupied the doorway, with the particular stillness of a man who had already decided what he could afford to lose. Atwater glared. "You have until the harvest prayer tomorrow afternoon, Sutton. Hand over the papers she stole, or you lose the herd." When Atwater rode out, Peregrine walked to the barn. He saddled 2 horses. He walked them back to the porch and handed the reins of the roan to Georgiana. He handed her a map. "The east trail takes you to the rail station," he said. "The north trail takes you to the cottonwoods." She looked at the reins. "If I leave, you keep your contracts." "I want you to stay," Peregrine said, looking her directly in the eyes. "But I will not prove I am different from Atwater by closing your roads. The choice is yours." Georgiana mounted the roan, and drove the little wagon east. Peregrine stood in the yard until the canvas top vanished beyond the rise. He had given her every road and discovered too late to hide it from himself how badly he wanted her to choose the one that led back. The yard resumed its old silence. It was not peaceful now. It was merely empty. Half an hour later, wheels rattled beyond the ridge. The wagon came back at a pace that made the roan toss its head. Before it stopped, Ida leaned from beneath the canvas. "I asked Aunt Georgiana whether we were leaving a good man because a bad man was shouting," she announced. "She said I asked too many questions." Georgiana pulled the wagon beside the porch. "She was right about the number of questions," she said. Then she met Peregrine's eyes. "Not about that one. Get your horse, Mr. Sutton. We have a box to dig up." They rode to the cottonwoods together, leaving the girls with a trusted neighbor. The autumn wind stripped the yellow leaves from the branches, covering the small mound of earth behind a patch of sagebrush. Peregrine took off his hat and stood silently by the grave. He did not ask questions. He did not push. Georgiana found the flat stone a few yards away and began digging with a hand trowel. Early frost had hardened the earth. Her hands shook. Peregrine knelt beside her with the larger shovel, but he did not take the work from her. "Which part do you want me to do?" he asked. She stopped. Her gaze moved from his face to the shovel. Then she handed him the trowel and pointed. "There, beneath the root." The edge of the tin box appeared beneath the dark soil. Georgiana reached for it, then went still. Both hands rested on the cold metal, but she could not lift it. For one long breath, it was not evidence against Atwater beneath her fingers. It was the last burden Valerie had placed in her keeping, and opening it meant touching the final hours of her sister's life again. Peregrine remained beside her without speaking. When Georgiana finally nodded, they raised the box together. Inside were the letters, the transit receipts, and Atwater's black ledger. Flipping through the pages, Georgiana pointed to the initials N.G. next to several transit records. "Nehemiah Gunderson," she said. "The driver. He must be the one delivering the women to the receiving houses." Peregrine looked at the initials. "He warned us about the riders. He didn't have to do that." He flipped a page and stopped. His finger traced a line under the heading Sutton Homestead. Next to his name, Atwater had written, "Isolated claim, widower, low resistance." Atwater was not only trapping women, he was using false marriage debts to break isolated homesteaders and take their claims. Peregrine felt the insult of it, but not the shame. Loneliness had made him visible to a thief. It did not make him weak. On the ride back, Georgiana did not take her own horse. She climbed onto the buckboard seat beside Peregrine and placed the tin box in his hands. He held it level across every rut. It contained her sister's memory, her family's danger, and the first trust she had offered without keeping one hand ready to reclaim it. "I used to think protecting someone meant standing in front of them," Peregrine said quietly, as the wagon rocked over the ruts. Georgiana rested her hand on the bench, her fingers brushing his coat. "Yesterday you asked me where I wanted to go," she said. "Tomorrow, I am asking you to stand beside me." Sunday afternoon brought a bitter chill and 50 people to the Sutton yard for the harvest prayer. Before the food could be blessed, Atwater arrived without haste. He stepped into the center of the gathering, laid a contract on the nearest table, and spoke as though he were reading an account already settled. "Georgiana Vaughan traveled under another woman's agreement," he said. "Sutton is holding property and records belonging to my company. Return both today, and this need goes no further." Georgiana walked out onto the porch. She held the tin box. Peregrine did not step in front of her. When Clara shivered at the sight of Atwater's men, he knelt and wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders. He stayed at the girl's height, one hand open on the porch board between them, while Georgiana faced the crowd in her own name. "My name is Georgiana Vaughan," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "Valeria Reeves was my sister. Ida and Clara are her daughters, and I have chosen to be their mother since the day I buried my sister in the dirt." She opened the box. She held up the original letters. "I wrote the letters to Mr. Sutton. I did not know Earl Atwater cut out the lines mentioning the children. I did not know he altered the tickets to send women to his receiving houses to work off debts they never agreed to." Atwater barely glanced at the letters. "Her grief does not alter the account," he said. "The contract bears another woman's name. Keep her here, Sutton, and you accept the debt with her." Peregrine stood up beside the girls. He walked to the table where Atwater had placed the contract. Peregrine picked up the paper, looked at it, and let it drop to the porch boards. "That piece of paper has no authority in my house," Peregrine said, addressing the crowd, accepting the loss of his cattle contracts right there in the open. "I don't want a wife because of a signature. I prayed for the woman who wrote those letters. I love the woman standing on my porch, and the 2 children she protects before herself." He turned to Georgiana, ignoring Atwater entirely. "When you are entirely free of any debt to me, Georgiana, will you stay and build a tomorrow here?" Georgiana looked at him without reserve. "Yes," she said. "Not because you saved me, because you left me room to walk to you myself." She stepped off the porch and took his hand. In front of the entire community, she reached into the box, pulled out the transit ticket with Atwater's red pencil mark, and tore it in half, letting the wind carry it away. Before Atwater could answer, a heavy freight wagon rolled into the yard. Nehemiah Gunderson climbed down. The hurried driver from the first morning was gone. He faced Atwater with the cold disgust of a man finished pretending obedience. "I heard Atwater at the freight office yesterday," Nehemiah said before anyone could question his arrival. "He told his riders he meant to take the Sutton herd after the harvest prayer. I followed them out of town and cut across the North Wash. They never knew I was behind them." He pulled folded statements from his coat and addressed the crowd and the district clerk. "The initials NG in Atwater's book do not stand for my name," he said. "Atwater thought they meant the North Gate. I used them for new ground the wagons I diverted before his men could deliver those women to the receiving houses." He looked at Georgiana. "I changed the baggage tags and filed false delivery slips. I put the uncut letters into the hands of the men who had written for wives, and I drove the women to claims I believed were safe. I brought you to Peregrine Sutton because he was the only man on Atwater's target list who did not ask how much labor a woman could perform. He asked what sort of life she hoped to build." Nehemiah handed the statements to the clerk. "3 women signed these before witnesses. I have copies of the remaining accounts hidden in town. Atwater's business is finished, whether he admits it today or not." The district clerk bent-picked Atwater's contract from the porch boards, laid Nehemiah's statements over it, and snapped his record book shut. "I will certify no seizure on this claim," he said. "These accounts go before the district judge." Atwater reached for the tin box. Peregrine rose, but Georgiana moved first and pulled it against her ribs. Then the neighbors stepped closer, not in a charge, but shoulder to shoulder. Atwater's hired men looked at the 50 homesteaders, lowered their hands, and backed toward their horses. There was no shootout. Atwater rode away beneath the quiet, crushing weight of a community that would no longer help him prey upon the isolated. Within the week, a territorial deputy marshal took Nehemiah's copies and the women's statements. Atwater's freight office was closed pending inquiry. The victory belonged first to Georgiana, who had spoken, and then to everyone who had chosen to believe her aloud. When the crowd finally dispersed, and the sun began to set over the Yellowstone Valley, the Sutton house returned to a quiet that no longer felt empty. Georgiana folded the original letter into the pages of her school ledger. She and Peregrine agreed to marry after the winter broke, when the choice would belong to them rather than to a contract or a watching town. Until then, the south room would be cleared for the girls, and the smaller room beyond it would become a free way station for any woman crossing the territory who needed one safe night without a debt attached. Georgiana would keep the school. Peregrine would make certain Atwater had not cut its winter supplies. Neither gift replaced the other's work. Peregrine stood in the kitchen doorway. I asked Ida if they wanted to take the Sutton name or keep Reeves. Georgiana paused, holding a stack of slates. What did she say? She said they'll keep Reeves because it belongs to their mother, but she reckons they'll figure out what to call me when the snow melts. Peregrine smiled with a genuine relaxed expression. I told her that was a fair bargain. He crossed to where Georgiana stood by the table. I prayed for a wife because I was afraid of dying alone, he said. I love you because since you arrived, I no longer want to live only for myself. I want the school noise, Clara's questions, Ida correcting my figures, and you telling me when I am being a stubborn fool. I want all of it if you choose it too. Georgiana looked at him, her eyes softening. Then you should start by sitting down, Mr. Sutton. You have been standing guard all day. She pulled out the chair beside hers. Peregrine sat and let out a long breath. Then, because love could not remain only something he gave, he accepted the cup she set before him and let her warm his hands around it. The next afternoon, the dusty wagon stood empty in the yard, with no canvas bags tied for a hurried departure. On the porch, Peregrine hung his hat on the iron peg Georgiana had cleared for him. Ida and Clara ran through the open door, their new slates clattering against the wood. Georgiana stood beside him on the upper step and placed her hand over his on the railing, not as a guest asking permission, and not as a bride delivered by paper, but as a woman choosing where to stand. 4 shadows stretched long and unbroken across the porch boards. None remained outside the light.